Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining the presentation. I'm Hesrie van Heerden, and I'm from a company called FACTS, Food and Allergy Consulting Testing Services, where I currently head up the Food Fraud Prevention Department. And today's presentation is specifically going to look at authenticity testing and the role it plays in food fraud prevention, whether it is a powerful weapon or in actual fact creating a false sense of security. So before we can answer that question, let's revisit what is food fraud. So there's multiple definitions for food fraud, and there's currently globally no regulated or standard definition. But in short, food fraud can be defined as the intentional deception for economic gain using food. So a subcategory of food fraud is EMA, or economically motivated adulteration. These two terms are often used interchangeably, but it's not the same thing. EMA is currently defined by the FDA as a substance for economic gain. So the keyword here is substance because it means it doesn't include all types of food fraud. So then looking at the different types of food fraud you get is you have substitution, dilution, concealment, unimproved enhancement, counterfeiting, mislabeling, and grey mark and forgery. So only 4 of these, which is your substitution, dilution, concealment, and unimproved enhancement, is an actual change to the product itself or where an undeclared substance is added. So this is referred to as adulteration or EMA. But it's very important for companies to not only address adulteration or EMA, but to look at all types of food fraud. So why do we prevent food fraud? So if there's one thing we can learn from past food fraud incidences, it's that it's usually have dire effects on public health. And this is not only referring to physical well-being, but also the emotional, mental, and ethical damages it can cause. Also, what goes hand in hand with food fraud is often major financial losses for companies. So you need to do it to protect your brand, your company, and also to prevent financial losses. Even though South African regulations do not specifically mention food fraud, there are several regulations and acts that are directly applicable, such as the Consumer Protection Act. And also, lastly, of course, if you're part of a GFSI certified scheme, then the standards usually have requirements regarding food fraud prevention, such as seen in BRC or FSCC 22000. But a key message here is that food fraud is much more than just an audit tick box exercise. It's much more than just trying to pass your audit. It's really, in essence, protecting your brand and your company and your consumers. If you have a food company, there's usually 4 peaks that you need to address to ensure food protection, which is your food quality, food safety, food fraud, and food offense. And even though they're all separate entities, they do overlap. Another pillar or peak that we've identified is your food legal compliance. So these 5 pillars together will ensure food integrity. You can't talk about this without mentioning your HACCP, VASCPs, and TACCPs. So HACCP is your management system for food safety, VASCP for food fraud, and TACCP for food defense. So VASCP stands for Vulnerability Assessment Critical Control Point, and it aims at preventing food fraud for all types of frauds for all your products. So there's multiple ways you can go about a VASCP system, but usually the steps that form the foundation of a comprehensive and effective VASCP system is these 5 ones, which is firstly your information gathering step, then identifying your food fraud opportunities, doing your vulnerability assessment, plugging this into your enterprise risk ranking, and then using this as the foundation for your prevention plan, which includes your countermeasures, such as testing. So the testing part in your VASCP aims and utilizes to detect food fraud and to prove that food products are authentic. So this is the question that we probably most see often in industry is, I want to test to make sure that my product is authentic. But what does this really mean? So if you look at the BRC definition for authenticity or authentic, is that it's ensuring that food or raw materials purchased and offered for sale are of the nature, substance, and quality expected. So food authenticity is quite an encompassing term, and it refers to multiple aspects of food. And even though it's highly applicable to food fraud, it's much broader than food fraud. So looking just at some of the aspects it entails, it looks at ingredients. If you have a single ingredient commodity or multi-ingredient commodity, is the ingredient composition is what it says it is. Looking also at food claims like sugar-free, gluten-free, high in protein, those type of claims. Authenticity can also refer to the production method, such as free-range or organic. Looking at product specifications, for example, bricks or density. The origin can refer or relate to the geographical origin or even the species. Then further looking at quality parameters such as the color or the shelf life of the products. And lastly, any other important product characteristics. So then authenticity testing in the fight against food fraud. Is this really a powerful weapon, or does a negative or absent result give you a false sense of security? So the answer to this question is it can be both. It can be an extremely powerful weapon for the fight against food fraud, but if it's not employed or utilized correctly, it can create a false sense of security. So there's multiple factors you need to carefully consider in order to ensure you achieve your testing objective to make sure that you have a powerful weapon against food fraud. So the rest of this presentation is going to look at a quick guide of tips of everything you need to consider to ensure that you are using authenticity testing correctly. The first step is perform a comprehensive vulnerability assessment. So what this means basically for you is the success of testing is proportional to the success of the preceding steps. Because if you do your vulnerability assessment properly, you will identify which ingredients for you or which materials, food materials, are vulnerable to food fraud, which will consequently help you decide which materials to test. So if it's not done correctly, you can either waste resources on testing products that are not necessary, or worst case, you can actually miss products that are highly subjected to food fraud and not test them. So you need to make sure that you gather valuable and reputable information, that you take all influencing factors into account, from the product itself, like the product matrix, to all the factors you need to consider in terms of your supplier. You need to consider all your food materials, not only looking at incoming ingredients, but also your finished products, because there's multiple points once the product leaves your facility where food fraud still can occur. And then to remember that you need to consider all types of food fraud, not only some, because ultimately the quality of your input information will consequently result in the success of your output. The second tip, and to me this is the key one, is to really understand the objective of the testing. So to understand the purpose and the aim of the analysis. Is it to confirm that the product says what it is? And unfortunately, there is no magical test that can do it all. So you need to then ask the questions whether you want to know, is it in terms of the origin, production method, food claims, ingredient composition, or is there a specific adulterant you're concerned about? Or do you want to screen for several adulterants? So answering these questions will ultimately determine what type of method you need to use. Do you need a targeted or a non-targeted test method? Do you require quantitative results or qualitative results? And it's extremely important to understand the objective of the testing, because this will help you achieve the results that you need and to interpret those results in terms of what you wanted to achieve. Next is, now that you've identified your test methods, it's to make sure that you use innovative test methods. So commercial test methods are not the silver bullet. It is required for continued due diligence, but it's not the silver bullet. And what we mean by this is that fraudsters, once it's known that a method or a fraud can be routinely and easily detected, they will resort to a different course of action. So they're always working to beat the test. So testing needs to be one step ahead to ensure early detection. So there's definitely in industry this growing demand for authenticity testing, but there is sometimes a lack of available commercial test methods. A solution to this is to look at custom analysis, so to develop a method or to see how you can use existing methods in different ways to ensure that you achieve your objective. So with food fraud testing, think outside the box. And also to keep in mind then that these custom methods are not always accredited or typically accredited, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the value in it is not the accreditation, but to make sure that it is able to detect what you need it to. Next is understand the test method and laboratory capabilities. So make sure you ask the right questions. Do the staff have the necessary technical expertise to support you? What testing methods are available and accessible? Because it doesn't help you find a test method, but only a laboratory overseas can do it, and there's a major challenge in getting the sample there. What is the method target analyzed? What are the method limitations? So is there any matrix interference you need to be concerned about, or cross-reactivity? What reference materials are used in the test method? And even though if the method isn't accredited, is it validated? And of course, sampling is always key when it comes to testing. So sampling location, the sampling equipment used, all those factors. And then lastly, testing is to support and reinforce prevention. So the goal is not to detect food fraud, but it's prevent it from happening in the first place. because by the time you detect it, it's already too late. So we need to shift from a reactive approach to a proactive approach. Early detection is key in protecting your company and consumers and brand from damages. Testing does not equal prevention. So testing is not a standalone solution. You need to go beyond detection. You need to deter and prevent. And by detect, deter, and preventing, you will disrupt the chemistry of the crime of food fraud. So let's put these tips to practical use. Let's say you perform your vulnerability assessment, and through this, you identify your coffee, instant freeze-dried coffee, as a vulnerable ingredient, because through your incident scanning, you notice there's been a lot of incidences with coffee in the past. It's a high-costing commodity. By horizon scanning, you might see climate change might affect coffee bean production, and there might be a supply and demand problem. And perhaps you see with your supplier questionnaires that there's a gap in your supplier knowledge. So after identifying this as a vulnerable ingredient, you need to determine the purpose and objective of the testing. Are you concerned about the origin? Do you want to confirm the origin of the coffee? Or are you concerned about adulteration and adulterants that could be in there? So for example, if you take a look at the Discerner's Food Fraud database, you'll see that they list several adulterants in their records that can potentially be in there. So that includes things like cereals and maltodextrin, caramelized sugar, glucose, a range of different adulterants. So let's say you want to determine if there's any adulterants present in your coffee. Now you need to find a test method. So there's multiple and a variety of methods available for testing coffee, whether you want to check the origin or, checking for adulterants. So there is, for example, methods where they do basically fingerprinting with the coffee, where they can then detect any organic compounds and quantify those organic compounds and see what else is in there. But this might be a very expensive approach, and you might not have the resources to do this. So then looking at the adulterants, you will notice a lot of them contain sugar, whereas coffee does not naturally contain sugar. So for that reason, you can potentially do sugar profiling to see if you can screen for any of those adulterants present. Now you need to understand your test method and laboratory capabilities. So remember, by performing the sugar profiling, you will only get an answer of whether there is any sugar components present in the product, but it won't tell you from the source or the origin of the sugar. So it will only tell you yes or no if there's something in there. So you need to consider that you'll not know the source if you do get a positive result. And lastly, you test to support and reinforce prevention. So do not just stop with the testing. Make sure you have your supply questionnaires, supply checks, audits, all of that in place as well to ensure that you definitely detect, deter, and prevent food fraud. So in conclusion, preventing food fraud is extremely important. And authenticity not only refers to one part of food, but to multiple parts of food. And it's not only applicable to food fraud, it is broader than that. But authenticity testing is an extremely powerful tool for food fraud detection. And it must be utilized correctly, because if it's not utilized correctly, testing can actually result in undetected risks by creating a false sense of security. So testing does not necessarily equal prevention, but it definitely does reinforce and support it. Thank you so much for SAAFoST for giving me the opportunity to present this. If you have any questions, you're welcome to let me know or contact me. Thank you.